As we enter the Shaman village, one of, if not the most visually striking areas of the DLC, we're confronted with the truth about Marika's past, a piece of it at least. With just 2 item descriptions, we learn that this place was once Queen Marika's home, likely long before she was queen of anything. And in classic From Software fashion, this beautiful place, these telling item descriptions, leave us with more questions than answers. Just questions we didn't previously know to ask. But among other lore revelations, we learn that Marika herself was once a shaman, or at least that's what her people were called long ago. And throughout the DLC, we learn what happened to the rest of her people. In an interview with Eurogamer months before the release of the DLC, Miyazaki stated, quote, "The past of the Lands of Shadow and Queen Marika would be told in the same way as the history of the Shattering War in the main story," end quote. Aside from perhaps Mikola himself, Queen Marika's lore probably gets expounded upon the most in the DLC. I won't say we definitively learn why she did what she did or how, but we're certainly given enough information to begin theory crafting and coming up with the most likely course of action Marika took to become god of the coming age. In a previous video I did, I attempted to cover all of the lore we got in regards to Marika throughout the DLC, why she did what she did, her motives, her sin, so on and so forth. But I feel as if I missed something that now to me appears to be blatantly obvious. Marika was likely, among her other shamans, put through the same brutal process of being jarred. If you aren't aware of exactly what that means, watch this video here. I'll go over it a bit throughout the video, but not in the same amount of detail. That being said, the Hornsent were trying to create a new form of life through the practice of jarring shamans and likely various other people, creatures, beasts, and so on. They were trying to create what they called saints. And while I previously didn't give this much thought, save the jarring process itself, it seems likely that Marika herself was the end result of what they were trying to do. That among many failed attempts, as illustrated by the grotesque jar innards enemy we fight throughout the game, something went just right in Marika's case that gave her the power to become god of the coming age. She achieved sainthood. The Hornsent turned her into something that could meld with a god. Shaman can meld with others, Empyreans/saints can meld with gods, and gods such as Marika are those saints who did meld with a god. Throughout this video, I'm going to attempt to prove these claims about what Marika is and how she became a god. Elden Ring lore is divisive, to say the least. Unlike, for example, Dark Souls, where small details of the lore are still largely up for debate, the overarching story, however, the themes are pretty well agreed upon. Elden Ring lore, as one of my favorite YouTube creators, Ratatosker, puts it, is largely uninterpretable. You'll find that in practically any Elden Ring lore discussion in the comments of a video or somewhere on Reddit, there's a huge amount of discourse. And not just in terms of small details regarding individual characters, but also the larger themes of what the creators are attempting to convey. We've come to rely on creators such as Tarnished Archaeologists or Nameless Singer, creators that take a much closer look at the archaeological evidence to support their claims. This kind of approach has become necessary given how uninterpretable certain aspects of Elden Ring's lore can be. This is especially important too, given that From Software rarely does anything by accident. If an item is placed in a certain location, a certain banner on a wall, a painting, a statue, just iconography in general, there's usually a good reason for it, some sort of lore implication. And 99% of the time, this sort of stuff is self-explanatory. Redmane Castle has weapons and provisions stored inside because it's a practical fort. The Landell Knight armor has the symbol of the Erd Tree on the breastplate because they worshipped the Erd Tree. Makes sense. And these examples aren't in any way telling, they just make sense. However, I bring this up because one of my first points when it comes to Marika being jarred is archaeological. In a near a limb just past the outer wall site of Grace, we come to these statues. These are 2 human-like figures seemingly being melded together by some sort of spiral shape wrapped around them. With context, the context of what the Hornsent believed religiously, and the context of what the Hornsent were doing with the jars, I think this statue is very telling, and here's why. Outside a ruined house known as the Whipping Hut in the Bonnie village, a Hornsent ghost NPC has the following to say. For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh sainthood itself awaits you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life for you accorded for this alone. The great jar item description reads, attire of the shamans who perform their worship at jails. They offer their prayers to the innards of the great jars, such that they might be reborn one day into sainthood. This is the cycle of death and rebirth taken into the hands of mortal men. The Hornsent were putting shamans into jars. I would assume most of you watching this video are already aware of this, but for completion's sake, I thought it worth mentioning. I think it's almost funny that the Great Jar item description refers to it as attire of the shamans. I don't think they wore this as a fashion statement. I believe it's referred to as attire because the shamans, along with an amalgamation of other things, were put inside the jar. Therefore, the jar itself became their attire. And this was a brutal practice. The tooth whip item description reads, whip bestrewn with rotting misshapen teeth. Filthy and seething with disease, the teeth are embedded in the whip and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of the shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. And the Ash of War painful strike reads, a chastening whip strike honed to maximize pain. The Bellarat jail and the Bonnie jail both show us what the outcome was of this grotesque practice with the jar innards enemy. Aggressively swollen, oozing pus and blood, these horrifying enemies are the result of the Hornsent practice of jarring shamans. Inside the Bellarat jail, there's another ghost NPC who says the following. Oh please, not the jar, anything but that. I promise I won't ever do it again. I swear a living saint I'll surely be. Please forgive me please. So even though supposed sainthood existed within the jar, clearly those put through this practice were not willing participants. Interestingly enough, not all Hornsent were in agreement with this practice either. The Greater Potentate's cookbook reads, haunted by the grotesque practice of his village of birth, he stuffed great pots with all manner of things. So we have a potentate who, disgusted by this practice, began stuffing pots with red flesh mushrooms, black fireflies, fulgur blooms, fly mold, and so on and so forth, which is lore-wise how we ended up with the recipes to create various different types of hefty pots. Just an interesting lore tidbit there. So the Hornsent were a crucible-worshipping people. The fine crucible feathered talisman reads, a talisman fashioned from thin feathers that embody the aspects of various creatures. Hornsent view the crucible as sacred for the refinement wrought through its evolutionary gifts, most prominently their tangled horns. The crucible was the primordial matter in which all life was blended together, also said to be the primordial form of the Erd tree. The crucible tree armor reads, holds the power of the crucible of life, the primordial form of the Erd tree, and the aspect of the crucible horns reads, this is a manifestation of the Erd tree's primal vital energies, an aspect of the primordial crucible where all life was once blended together. As a crucible-worshipping people, the Hornsent were trying to make a crucible of life of their own, the jars serving as the crucible itself, and the beings inside being the blending of life. This is the, quote, cycle of death and rebirth taken into the hands of mortal men, referred to in the Great Jar item description. Mere mortal men attempting to recreate that which they see as divine, basically evolution, but man-made. And this is what I believe is being illustrated in the statue I spoke about previously. This statue is a flattering portrayal of what is supposedly taking place inside the jar, two beings being brought together by a spiral. The incantation Spira reads, superior sorcery of the tower priests, wielded as an incantation of the spiral. The spiral is a normalized crucible current that one day will form a column that stretches to the gods. While it seems as if various factions had different illustrations for what they viewed the Crucible to be, the Hornsent viewed it as a sort of spiral, its physical manifestation at least. This is why in Bellarat Tower and near Elim itself, much of the iconography is spiral-orientated. Statues, stairways, even a near Elim is in the shape of an upward spiral. For example, as time went on, post-Erdtree, it seems the Crucible was viewed almost strictly as the primordial form of the Erdtree, even though during Hornsent times it was viewed as the primordial form of all life. The Crucible tree helm reads, "The great tree ornamentation is the Knight Celeria's mark. Displayed also by her men, holds the power of the Crucible of Life, the primordial form of the Erdtree." I believe what the Crucible tree helm, along with Celeria's tree, is depicting is something known as the process of suckering. Any arborists watching this video, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's when a tree is damaged or even cut down, little saplings or branches begin to sprout from the stump and compete with one another. So, quite literally, an illustration of a primordial tree coming of age. Now, moving on from this primordial tree tangent, the statue. Two beings melding together, wrapped in a spiral that looks eerily organic, and again, stated by the Toothwhip item description, the flesh of the shamans is said to meld harmoniously with others. The statue is embellishing, a tame representation of the pseudo-sacramental practice of jarring shamans, as opposed to the reality of what was taking place, a horrifying, torturous process. But for the Hornsent, it was all worth it. It was a divine practice. And if I may take this one step further, I believe quite strongly that this statue is a representation of Marika and Ratigan inside the jar. This just as easily could be a representation of any two beings being melded together in the jar, but given I believe that Marika was the pinnacle of the Hornsent's success with this practice, I'd go so far as to say that this likely represents the two of them. The nature of what Marika is the very thing that allowed her to become what the Hornsent desire. Her being a shaman, the innate ability of shamans to meld with others. It's pretty interesting that the shaman have this ability, but it sort of makes sense when you couple it with evidence from the base game. Now this requires you to believe that the Shaman, Newman, and the Nox are all different names for the same group of people, just changed over the ages. I thought this was pretty clear in-game, but after my last video I found that a few people were skeptical about this. If you want more evidence for this, watch this video here, or this video by Smotown. Goes way more in depth on the relationship between the Newman and the Nox in the base game, given that it came out before the DLC. But regardless, the Newman/Nox being tied to and likely creating the Silver Tears. Their weapons, such as the Nox Flowing Sword and the Nox Flowing Hammer, quote, forged from a liquid metal from a silver tear, end quote. That theirs was a people who clearly used alchemical means to accomplish all manner of things in their society, and to discover that they themselves were alchemical in nature, with the ability to meld with others. Not overly important information in regards to the scope of this video, but I find it interesting nonetheless. The Great Jar's item description really touches on the hubris of the Hornsent when it says, quote, "This is the cycle of death and rebirth taken into the hands of mortal men." The jarring of the shaman is a very crude and human version of what they view as divine. The man tries to create God. They idolize this, and Bellarat and Near Elim with their beautiful statues and spiral iconography, finding divine purpose in this brutal process. It's a cruel imitation of what life has done naturally for generations, the process of life evolving and taking on new form. They venerate things such as horns because they're a remnant of a time past where these sorts of genetic traits were all over the place. Yet now, the more someone has, the more divine they are. But that's the kicker. It's this natural phenomenon that occurs. Life evolves. Life changes. There's really nothing divine about it. It's evolution. However, the Hornsent in their hubris tried to take this process, this natural phenomenon, and wield it. And in doing so, they created monstrosities. But perhaps not all attempts by the Hornsent to do this were complete failures. Now, obviously, something divine is going on. Marika did ascend the divine stairs and become a god. There is real power in the Crucible of life. However, my point is simply that I believe what the game is trying to show us, what Miyazaki is trying to show us, is that the Hornsent destroyed themselves. They were destroyed by their own hubris. They tried and failed time and time again to create a saint, and at some point they created Marika. And Marika was the beginning of the end for the Hornsent. But seeing as they created her, or her as she is now, this is likely the betrayal referred to in the DLC. The Hornsent view her as their divine creation, a product of their sacred practice of jarring. They made her, yet she betrayed them, at least in their eyes. So the fact that Marika and Radagon quite literally share a body is probably the strongest argument for Marika being a product of the jarring practice. They're two beings melded together, and the flesh of the shamans is said to meld harmoniously with others. With the context of everything we learn in the DLC, as stated previously in this video, it just makes sense. Not that there aren't other examples of beings sharing a body, namely Miquella and Saint Trina. However, given the lore surrounding Shaman Village and what happened to the shamans, the knowledge that Marika was a shaman, Miquella likely had this ability due to his mother having it, and Marika likely had this ability because of the jarring process. But I'll get into more of that later. I want to talk about the use of the word saint. The Hornsent practice of jarring was an attempt to create saints. We know this based on the ghost NPC dialogue used at the Whipping Hut, along with other references to sainthood used throughout the DLC. It seems like sainthood has something to do with two beings melded together, or perhaps a single being melded with an outer god. Two notable saints we learn quite a bit about in the DLC are Romina, Saint of the Bud, and obviously Saint Trina. According to her remembrance, Romina discovered a quote, twisted divine element, which she weaved into the baleful scarlet rot. And when we see Romina, she is clearly merged with the scarlet rot itself, as she inflicts rot damage. Most of her body is a giant scorpion. The rot god is assumed to physically appear as a giant scorpion, implied by the scorpion stinger item description. Quote, dagger fashioned from a great scorpion's tail, glistening with scarlet rot. A ceremonial tool used by heretics, crafted from the relic of a sealed outer god. So Romina, Saint of the Bud, merged with the outer god of rot, or simply scarlet rot itself, and became what we see in battle in the DLC. Melania is also merged with the outer god of rot, which requires no explanation given that her remembrance literally is the remembrance of the rot goddess, among a litany of other evidence. But Melania is not referred to as a saint, she's referred to as an Empyrean. Probably the most common explanation used for what an Empyrean is comes from Ronnie's dialogue in Ansel River. Quote, I was once an Empyrean of the demigods. Only I, Miquella, and Melania could claim that title. Each of us was chosen by our own two fingers as a candidate to succeed Queen Marika and to become god of the coming age. During Millicent's questline, Sage Gowry states, in the age of the Elden Ring and Queen Marika, the precious Empyrean was born, a new god to forge a new order. We know that Marika was an Empyrean from this dialogue, along with the remembrance of the Black Blade, which states, Malekith was a shadowbound beast given to his Empyrean. Marika's sole need for her shadow was a vessel to lock away destined death. Even then, she betrayed him. This is speculative on my part, and I don't exactly have it all worked out, but essentially I think it's pretty clear that Saint and Empyrean is the same thing. And to be considered an Empyrean, you have to have the ability to meld with an outer god. Not to say that all Empyreans are melded with outer gods, just that they need the capacity to do so. Saint Trina is melded with some sort of flower, and Miquella is melded with Saint Trina. Melania is melded with the rock god, Marika is melded with the greater will in the form of the Elden Ring itself, and formerly was melded with others inside the jar, in my opinion, Radagon. Romina, Saint of the Bud, is melded with the Scarlet Rot. Romina isn't explicitly stated to be an Empyrean, but I tend to believe that she probably is, or would be considered one if you want to get technical. In terms of Empyreans we know of, that leaves Ranni and the Glowmite Queen. The Glowmite Queen may be the most lore-divisive character we never get to see in the entire game, but she was stated to be Empyrean in the Black Flame Ritual item description. And that leaves Ranni, who's melded with a doll. Leave comments below on this one if you have other opinions. It's not important to the scope of this video, so I don't need to get into it, but when the game first released, there was some discourse in terms of what the conditions had to be to create an Empyrean. The Remembrance of the Goddess of Rot states, Miquella and Malenia are both the children of a single god. As such, they are both Empyreans, but suffered afflictions from birth. So the fact that the twins were born of a single god caused them to be Empyreans. They were the same as their mother by way of having singular parentage. Less children and more offshoots. But it doesn't mean it's the only way to become Empyrean, which I believe the DLC clears up quite nicely given the amount of lore we got in terms of Marika's past. But the theory here is simply that to be considered a saint, to be considered an Empyrean, you must possess the ability to meld with an outer god. And ascending to godhood is exactly that, melding with a god, to become a god. Shamans possess the ability to meld with others, not necessarily other gods, just others. And I believe the jarring process by the Hornsent was an attempt to create a being who not only could meld with others, but could meld with the divine. We know quite literally that Marika was the vessel for the Elden Ring. We behold it in the final boss fight of the main game. So when Marika shattered the Elden Ring and her body shattered with it, this requires little to no explanation. The explanation of her fractured state is plain for us to see. However, I believe the symbolism of fractured Marika goes beyond the shattering of the Elden Ring, as well as the symbolism of her containing the Elden Ring inside her body, a crucible for the Elden Ring, as the jars were a crucible for all forms of life during the jarring process. Throughout the game, we come into contact with many living jars, base game and DLC, and in almost every case, the jars are fractured. Some more than others, but the cracks are there. Even Jar Baron, who dreams of being a warrior but has never seen battle, has cracks. The jars are not one thing, but many things, the remains of many put into a vessel, and Marika is no different. She is the result of many different forms of life melded into one. And she's aware of this. We know she's aware of this based on the revenge she sought against the Hornsent for what they did to her people. Marika knows what she is. And this might be where things begin to get a little unhinged, but bear with me on this. I strongly believe that many of Marika's children are simply the offshoots of undesired traits she picked up in the jar. Simply an attempt by Marika to become whole again, to return to what she was before she was put through the process of being jarred. Kite Tales has a great video on this subject, so check that out if you want to hear more about it. So we know the parentage of Ranni, Rykard, and Radahn, Rennala, and Radagon. We know the supposed parentage of Morgott, Mohg, and Godwyn. Quick tangent here, but at one point in the DLC, the Hornsent Grand Dam says, in regards to Marika, quote, "A curse upon thee, rotten miscreant. A curse upon the Strumpet's progeny, upon Marika's children each and all. The curse of the omen shall strike thee down in the form of the sacred beast's ire." The only two of Marika's children who suffer the omen curse are Morgott and Mohg. It's suspicious, to say the least. If Godwyn suffered the omen curse as well, it wouldn't be. The only three of her children born by standard means between her and Godfrey. Rykard, Ranni, and Radahn were born of Radagon and Rennala, so not exactly Marika, not exactly standard means. And Miquella and Malenia, as I stated earlier, are more offshoots than children. But then why doesn't Godwyn suffer the omen curse? Perhaps he's not really Godfrey's son. I'll probably make a video about that, so subscribe if you're interested, but anyhow. So these are the children where the parentage really isn't in question. And then you have Malenia and Miquella, Messmer and Melina. Melina is strongly implied to be Mesmer's sister by way of the Mesmer's kindling item description, quote, Mesmer, much like his younger sister, bore a vision of fire. If you don't believe that Melina is one of Marika's children, that's fine. It doesn't affect this theory, but here it goes. Melania was born afflicted with the scarlet rot, and the scarlet rot was an aspect of the outer god of rot. Melina, the kindling maiden, burned and bodiless, holds power over the flame of the giant's forge, witnessed by us when she burns the Erd tree, and the fell god grants the ability to wield flames to the giants. Mesmer was born with the abyssal serpent inside of him, which was sealed with the seal of grace by his mother. His remembrance states, quote, Yet having done so, her fear compelled her to secret away her child within the realm of shadow, end quote. The god-devouring serpent exists and was seemingly worshipped at one time in the Volcano Manor at the Temple of Iglay, also referenced in the serpent god's curved sword, which states, quote, Curved sword fashioned in the image of an ancient serpent deity, and tool of a forgotten religion practiced on Mount Gelmir, end quote. And Mikola, born cursed with eternal youth, who begrudgingly I failed to be able to tie to any of the gods or higher beings mentioned in-game. I mean, obviously Saint Trina, but I don't believe she's ever stated to be any sort of outer god. And I can throw Godwyn into the mix because we can pretty easily tie him to the unnamed ancient dragon god who Placidusac served, given his relationship to the dragons, but Godwyn's really of no consequence here. I not only believe that Marika was put through the process of being jarred, but that her jar contained various aspects of various outer gods in attempts to make her able to meld with a god, and that in birthing a number of her children, she was attempting to become whole again, attempting to become herself again, not an amalgamation of various things, but as she was before she was changed, when she was simply a shaman. She cast off these traits that she picked up in the jar, and they created many of what we know as her demigod children. It doesn't take an Elden Ring scholar to know that Marika was fractured in more ways than one. Her past is a tragic one. Her people stole away, killed, or worse, by the Hornsent, forced to undergo the same horrific process by the Hornsent as the rest of her people, only to be thrust into a role that she had no choice in, becoming their saint. And as we know from Saint Trina's dialogue in the Garden of Deep Purple, Godhood is a prison. Marika was a happy accident of the Hornsent. In attempts to create their saint, they dabbled in territory that they had no business in. They toyed with the divine, and with many failed attempts creating horrors beyond imagine, they created Marika, who spent most of her life seeking and exacting revenge for her people, and attempting to become whole again, only to become fractured herself. I know it's out there, but that's my favorite part of these games, trying to piece it all together. I'm new to making these types of videos, so let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.